Today's daf is Kuf Ayin Gimel, 173 in Masechet Bava Batra, and we got to the first word on the page actually. But I'm going to review quickly. So our Mishnah said yesterday that if two people in the same town have the same name, this creates all kinds of problems for their documents, right? Because Yosef ben Shimon and there's Yosef ben Shimon 1 and Yosef ben Shimon 2. If a debt comes out, a document says Yosef ben Shimon owes $100 to Yosef ben Shimon, then how do you know the one who's holding it is the one who was the one who lent the money, right? Maybe he's the one who borrowed the money, let's say. Now, why would he have the star? So we'll discuss that in a little bit. But yesterday, we added a detail and said, according to Abaye at least, that if someone is named Yosef ben Shimon and they lend money to somebody and they walk into court and say, I, Yosef ben Shimon, lent $1,000 to Ruvain, and I have the document, that would be okay. You can collect with that document because why? Why don't you assume that maybe Ruvain can go back and say, well, I didn't borrow it from you. I borrowed it from the other Yosef ben Shimon. And, maybe he's away or maybe he doesn't mind. So we said because l'nefila dechad lo chashinan, you don't worry that something will fall and will be picked up and found by somebody else who is the exact same name, meaning someone who is only person who could find it who would be meaningful. That's very far-fetched. In general, you might worry that people drop things, someone else finds them. And that was the case yesterday of a document that said, I owe money to the bearer, the holder of this document. So that was yesterday's discussion. Today, top line of Kuf Ayin Gimel, we introduce a new Braita which disagrees with our Mishnah. And we're going to try to understand what this Braita actually holds that causes it to disagree with our Mishnah. Before we get too far, I just want to warn you, we're going to have a third Braita later today that disagrees with this Braita. So we currently have one opinion in our Mishnah. We're about to introduce number 2. We'll get to number 3. Says the Gemara on top of Daf Kuf Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph, what about the following Braita, which says, just like our Mishnah's rule that two people with the same name in the same city cannot have a debt one on the other, the Braita adds to that and says, just like they cannot have a shtar chov zeh al zeh, one on the other, they actually can't collect from other people. So unlike what we said yesterday in our Mishnah, that a person named Yosef ben Shimon, who is one of two people with that name in one town, can bring a debt against somebody else, the Braita says you can't. That because you live in a town and you can't differentiate between these two people unless you use the rules of the third generation, fourth generation, things like that, then you can't bring a debt on somebody else. So the question is, why not? What would be the basis for this Tana to argue with our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, the difference between them is a question of otiyot nikneit b'mesira. The question of, remember, if you have a shtar, if one person has a shtar that says somebody else owes them money, if you give that shtar to somebody else, if Ruvain has a shtar that says Shimon owes him money, and Ruvain hands that shtar over to Yehuda, is that shtar given over to Yehuda without a separate kinyan, right? Or without like money or something to buy it? So the question is whether otiyot, which means letters in a shtar, are konot by mesira, by giving it over, kemifligi. Tana didan savar, the Tana of our Mishnah holds that otiyot niknot b'mesira, that letters are given over b'mesira, which means that if one Yosef ben Shimon has a shtar that says Ruvain owes him money, and he gives that shtar to the other guy with his same name in the town, the other one now becomes the owner of the shtar and can collect the money. So it really doesn't matter to us if the originator of the loan was this Yosef ben Shimon or the other Yosef ben Shimon. The fact is that it was whoever holds the shtar now is the one who owns the loan. And Tana Bra, the Tana of the Braita, the Tana of the outside, the other source, Savar, Ein Otiot Niknot b'Mesira, that Otiot are not Niknot b'Mesira. And so therefore, even though a man is holding a shtar that says, I, Yosef ben Shimon, to say, I, Yosef ben Shimon lent money to Ruvain, if you can't prove that you're the one who lent the money, and it's possible that the other Yosef ben Shimon lent the money, and somehow you got the shtar, he gave it to you, then you can't prove that the loan is owed to you. And Ruvain can claim, I don't owe it to you. I owe it to the other guy. I'm willing to pay the other guy. He's away or he's whatever. He's not alive. I don't know. And therefore you can't, unless you have a document which says, we transferred over the shtar and we made a kinyan, you don't assume that it was done with the proper kinyan. Or This is a variation. Ibaidema could be the kuliyama otiot niknot b'mesira. Everyone agrees that otiot are niknot b'mesira, but hacha b'tzarich lahavi ra'aya k'mifligi. The question is, do you have to prove that it was done? And this was a debate we had earlier. Tana didan savar, the Tana of our Mishnah holds ein tzarich lahavi ra'aya. You don't have to bring a proof or witnesses or written proof that you actually were given over the shtar legally, as opposed to finding it or getting it illegally. And therefore, you don't have to prove it. So the fact that you're holding the shtar is essentially proof that it's your shtar. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily were the original owner of the shtar. But the fact that you're holding it now, and the fact that otiyot or niknot b'mesira, meaning giving over that shtar gives over the rights to you, means that you are now the right bearer. You're the holder of the rights. And Tana Bra Savar Tzarch Lavi Ra'aya, the Tana of the right holds you have to bring a proof. Itmar, in fact, we have a statement where this has been debated. Again, this is not the Tanaim, these are Amoraim, but the point is you see that it's an argument. Otiyot niknot b'mesira, the statement of the Gemara is, in this case, that otiyot, that document of a shtar, can be transmitted to somebody else by giving it to them. And Abaya says, Sarich lahavi raya, but you have to bring a proof that supports the fact that it was given over to you, and you have to document that you didn't just find it. And it's a lost thing. It's that actually was handed over to you. And Rava says, Eino tzarich lahavi raya, and Rava says you don't have to bring a proof of that. You can just assume that since the person's holding it, that it was given over. Says Abaya, Mina minala. Says Abaya, what's my source? That if you're holding a document, you still have to prove that it was given to you. The Tanya, because we have the following Braita, which is a little bit relevant to our Mishnah. Says the Braita, Echad min ha'achim. Let's say you have a father who dies, right? And he leaves over sons. And one of the sons, a year later or whatever, again, I'm picking times that are random, but a year later, comes out with the document that says, the father owns a building or something, or the father lent money to somebody else, and the son says, well, this is part of my Yerusha. I got my father's document. This brother has the loan document from his father that he now produces. And he says, this is part of my chelek. It doesn't have my name, it's my father's name, or it's the family's name. I have this document, I want to go and collect. Right? Now, the other brothers, of course, say, what are you talking about? That was our father's. How come you have it? So says the Braita, alav lahavi ra'aya, that brother has to prove that he got this document legitimately, right? So you see that even though you hold otiyot niknot b'mesira, even though holding the document is clearly passed over to the sons from the father, the fact is you have to prove that it was given to you with a legitimate claim from the person who originally held it, or with the family that originally held it. So my love, hu adin lachrini. Says Abaya, the same thing would be true in this is a unique case of brothers, but presumably the case would be the same with other people. If anyone else has a document, you have to prove it as well. And Rava says to you, you missed the exact point of the Braita. I disagree, because sha'ani achin tishamtu mehadadi. Brothers are a very unique case, right? Because the case of brothers is, for many reasons, they have access to everything that everybody else has access to, right? Normal case, you have no one, a stranger has no right or no likelihood to come into my house, take a shtar from me, and walk away with it, right? It's not normal. But brothers have access because they are all joining in the estate. So it's very reasonable to think that in the dispersion of the estate and going through the documents, one brother took something that maybe was not legitimately given to him. And therefore, says the Braita, this brother has to prove that it was given to him legitimately and he can collect a loan. But it says, Rava, that's the exception. And the exception proves the rule that in general, if a person shows up with a shtar, you assume that they got it legitimately. And that otiyot niknot b'mesira, you don't have to bring a proof. Again, there might be exceptions if someone was our heir, someone laid a claim and said, no, I disagree, it was mine. That might change it. But in general, you don't have to bring proofs. That is Rav's opinion. Says the Gemara, Ika, we are around a third of the way down, probably, in the eighth to last narrow line. Ikadamri, some actually had the same discussion in a different version, as Gemara loves to do. Amar Rava, that Rava used this Braita as a proof to himself, that when you get a shtar, it's niknot b'mesira, it's given over with the handing over of the shtar, and you don't have to bring a proof that it was given to you. And says Rava, what's my proof? Mina minala. What's my proof? The Tanya, exactly the same Braita, because the Braita says, Echad min ha'achim, if you have one brother, shashtar chov yotzei mitachat yado, that one brother produces a shtar that he says, was from my father's estate and is now mine. Alav lahavi raya. He has to prove that it was legitimately given to him. And says Rava, that's a proof to me because it's brothers. Achinhu d'shamtu me'adadi. It's brothers who, because they're sticky fingers there. They all have access and they take from each other and they are able to take over illegitimately. Aval achrini lo. But you see that in a regular case where it's not brothers, it's just regular people. If a person shows up with a star, presumably they don't have to bring any proof that their star is accurate. And says Abaya, that's not a proof at all because achin, it's strichla. The reason the Braita talks about brothers is not to tell you brothers and nobody else. It's because brothers, Sagadai Chamina, you would have thought, says Abaya, everybody needs to bring a proof. But you might have thought brothers don't need to bring a proof. Why? Because given the Shamtum Hadadi, since they have access to each other, you might have thought, Ema Mizdaher Zahiri, that they're extra careful. Right? Everybody knows when they come to divide the estate, you got to watch out to make sure nothing disappears, right? So you might think that they catalog everything accurately and they keep a watch over it because exactly this scenario. They're afraid that one person is going to walk off with it. And therefore, maybe brothers actually, you don't have to bring a proof because the fact that one brother has it means that the other ones let him keep it. Right? You might have thought that even though, says Abaya, I hold that generally you do have to bring a proof that you got the star legitimately or accurately. In brothers, you don't have to. Kamashmal that even with them, you have to. And so therefore, this Braita is not exactly a proof to Rava, though it does support Rava in some ways, or Rava says that, but it could very well be that the Braita is not against Abaya's contention that you always have to bring a proof if you have a star that's not written necessarily to you or that has a name that could be somebody else. And it's just that with the brothers case, you really have to speak it out explicitly because you might have thought things are different when you come to an inheritance. So that is the second opinion. So remember, there's now two opinions. The Mishnah, which said that a person named Yosef ben Shimon, in fact, can have a debt, have a loan, a chov against somebody else, right? And if you're holding the star, you say, the fact that I'm holding it means that it's mine. The Braita that we just quoted, which says you cannot do that, right? Because the Braita probably holds that if you can't prove that the star is yours, either otiot or not niknot b'mesira, or they are, but you have to bring a proof. And now we have a third Braita. Says the Gemara now, the last narrow line, the last word on the line, Ella haditanya. What about the following third Braita? And the third Braita says, Kishem shemotziin hein shtarchov al achirim, just like, and this is going on our Mishnah, just like our Mishnah said, that a person named Yosef ben Shimon can have a debt against somebody else, meaning they can bring a shtar that says Ruvain owes them money. Kach motziin zeh al zeh. In fact, they can have a debt on each other. So if one person named Yosef ben Shimon has a document that says that I, Yosef ben Shimon, lent $1,000 to Yosef ben Shimon, and they present it to court, the other person will have to pay. Again, not like our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said you can't take a debt one on the other. This Braita says you can. B'mai kamiflagi, says the second wide line. What is the difference in our Mishnah and this Braita? The question is whether kotvin shtar leloveh la'afalpish ein malveh imo kamiflagi. Would you ever write a shtar for a borrower if the lender is not present? Right? We've talked about this many, many times. It's a great review. That let's say a person shows up to the court and the scribe and he says, "Look, I want to borrow $1,000 to buy a house. I'm going to go to the bank or to my friend." And I'm going to ask for money, and he's going to say, well, I don't want to lend you money without a document, right? Because otherwise you'll never pay me back. And so I want you to pre-write a document that says that let's say a regular case, I, Ruvain, am going to borrow money from Shimon today, $1,000, sign it, the witnesses sign it, sealed, signed, confirmed in court. Ruvain holds this document. This is a very dangerous document because if he loses it and Shimon finds it, Shimon can collect from him. Right? But Ruvain says this is really important to me. And it's Ruvain's problem. If he wants to write it, he's taking the risk on himself. So that would be, you write a shtar for a borrower, even if the malva is not there. So the court will write that shtar. Now, if you say the court will write that shtar, then you can get into big trouble. Because if a guy named Yosef ben Shimon comes to court, he can say to the court, I want to borrow money from the other Yosef ben Shimon. Write me a document that says that I, Yosef ben Shimon, borrowed $1,000 from Yosef ben Shimon. But since nothing in the document says who's the Yosef ben Shimon, the concern is that he'll just turn around a week later and say, look, I've got a signed document in court that says Yosef ben Shimon owes me money, right? So that is only a problem if you would write the document for the lova when the malva is not there. If you need both parties to be there, then of course this would never happen because the other Yosef ben Shimon would never agree to it if he knows it could be abused, right? So let's read that inside. I'll read the second line again.
If he brings it back, the court could say you wrote your document to yourself and throw him out of court.
Go to a different court, go to a different town, right? It's true. But I mean, obviously, if they remember him from a week ago, it's not going to have a big effect. But it could be 10 years later, right? But my
Yeah, but
commitment,
they could still see that. They could look at him and say, "Wait, you're the Yosef ben Shimon." They'll throw him out. They'll laugh at him. They say, "What are you talking about? You wrote it yourself for yourself, and you want to make a mockery of the court system, and then throw him out
that's
of court."
That's what our Mishnah says, that you can't do it, right? That's exactly what our Mishnah said. The Braita disagrees because the Braita maintains that you would never write a document for one person if the other person was not there. In which case, the fact is, if the other Yosef ben Shimon was in court and agreed to do this, it must be because he's really borrowing the money and he needs to agree, right? So it says them right now, let's read that inside. But my committee, so what do they argue? The kotvin shtar leloveh, whether you write a shtar for a potential borrower, even though there's no lender there, because he says to the court, I want to go and try to borrow money. So give me a shtar. Kamifligi. Tana didan savar. So Tana of our Mishnah holds, which is how we generally paskin, kotvin shtar lelovev afal pishin malve imo. That you would write a document for a borrower who says, I want you to write a document in Beit Din and confirm it and sign it and witness it because I want to go borrow the money, even though the malva is not present. And therefore, it's like as you just said, Ken, it's a problem. Zimnin, the Azal Agabe Safra, we're afraid he's going to go to the Sofer and the Sahadi and witnesses. He's going to go to court. He's going to hire them. And he said to them, Kitvuli Shtara, look, can you write for me a shtar that says that I, Yosef ben Shimon, borrowed $1,000 from the other Yosef ben Shimon. Dibainan the Mezef Yosef ben Shimon Chavri. I want to borrow money from my friend Yosef ben Shimon, right? And they sign it. Ubatar de Katvi v'chatmile, right? He after they write it and sign it, he'll then take that shtar, Nakitale, that shtar, v'amar le, and he'll go to the other Yosef ben Shimon and say, "Pay up, buddy. Havli mea diyasvi minai. Give me the money that you borrowed from me. I have proof. I have a document that says that you, Yosef ben Shimon, borrowed $100 from me, Yosef ben Shimon." So obviously, as you put it, that's a mockery. You can't do that. And that's why our Mishnah said that there's no way to collect from one on the other within the same town or same context. But Tana Brasavar,
How did the other Yosef ben Shimon get the star?
no, he didn't. The
No,
first
he didn't. So wait a minute. What you just said, he go to him and said, "Pay up," but you're assuming that the one this person goes to court. He says, "Write me a star. I'm going to borrow money from number two."
correct.
And so, how did number two ever get the star to say, "Pay up"? I gave you money.
No. So we're worried that number one is going to take the star and walk up to number two and say, "You owe me $1,000. I have proof that you owe me money."
No, he's not saying you owe me. He's saying I'm going to borrow from you.
He says to the court, I'm going to borrow from him. So
Right.
write me a document. The court writes him a document.
Right.
Says Yosef ben Shimon is borrowed $1,000 from Yosef ben Shimon. We're worried that the same number one who went to court is going to now, a year later, walk over to the other Yosef ben Shimon and say, look, I have proof that you borrowed money from me. I have a signed and sealed document. Pay up, even though you never borrowed. Says
Well, the document was created so that he himself could borrow money.
well, but there's nothing in the document that says that, right? So that's the problem. But Tana Bra Savar, the outside Tana, meaning the other Tana that we just quoted, who says that you're allowed to do this, holds Ein kotvin shtar malve imo, that you wouldn't write a star for number one if number two was not in the room. And so, since you wouldn't do that, therefore, there was no worry that number one is going to have a false or a false loan. He's going to write a star. The only case you would write a star for number one is if number two was there. Now, if number two is in the room, he's going to say, wait a second, don't write the star. I don't want to owe him money unless he really did borrow money. And so in a real case, number two is desperate for $1,000. He agrees to write this document, and number one better hold on to it because number one loses it, right? He can be in big trouble. But number one writes a star with the lova in the room, I'm sorry, with the malva in the room, and he can borrow the money. Continues the Gemara, the two dots. The Mishnah said,
So these are the two opinions, right? One says you do write it, one says you don't write it.
correct. And therefore, if you do write it, then you cannot have a document for two people in the same town with the same name. If you don't write it, then you can.
Don't write it. What?
If you don't write it without the other person being in the presence, then you're allowed to have a document that has the same name for both the lender and the borrower, and you could collect one from the other.
Wait. If you
explain it
don't write
again?
it, then what star do you have? I don't understand.
If you don't write, remember, if you don't write, it means you don't write it unless both people are present. So then you write it when both people are present.
Okay.
Don't write it means you don't write it for one without the other. Continue the Mishnah. Let's say Nimsa le'echad ben shtarotav. Let's say a person finds among his documents, right? You've got obviously these were very precious in those days, right? There were no digital documents. So you had your documents together about all the loans and all the debts you had, and you find among those documents Shtaro shel Yosef ben Shimon Parua, the loan of that I gave to Yosef ben Shimon has been repaid. Okay, so this guy, he's a third party, Ruvain, has a bunch of documents, and he wanted, and each Yosef ben Shimon in town borrowed money from him. Now we're going to say, how could he borrow money? We just said that you're not allowed to borrow money, right? But he has one document that says Yosef ben Shimon owes him $100. Another one says Yosef ben Shimon owes him $200. They're for different people. But he also finds that among his letters a document that says Yosef ben Shimon paid me back. Now, he doesn't know which one paid him back. So the Mishnah made it sound like, well, since you don't know which one, you can't hold it against either one. Shtarot shnehem peruin. They are both considered to be paid back. Okay? It says more, but we just said you're not allowed to lend money, or you have no claim against Yosef ben Shimon. Because each Yosef ben Shimon could come to the Ruvain guy and say, it wasn't me, it was the other guy, right? Says the Gemara, Ta'ama dinimsa. The Mishnah implies that the reason that Reuven can't go and collect the debts from Yosef ben Shimon is because he has a shover. He has a receipt that says one of them paid him back. Halon himself, let's say he had no receipt such as that. He can go and collect from Yosef ben Shimon, Matzi Mapik. He can go and collect from them. But we just said in the Mishnah, Hanan, we just said, it should say Hanan Tznan, or this is the way we usually say it. We just learned, quote now, V'lo acher yachol hotzi alihem shtar chov tanan. Right? We just learned, sorry, I put the words together, that another person, Ruvain, a third party, cannot go and have a star. It says, Yosef ben Shimon owes me money, because the person can always say it was the other Yosef ben Shimon. So our whole Mishnah makes no sense. It says Rabbi Yirmiyah, no, the Mishnah is going about what we talked about at the end of the Mishnah, b'mishulashim, where you gave a third name, right? You gave three families, Yosef ben Shimon ben Ruvain, or Yosef ben Shimon ben Yaakov. Right. And so therefore you can lend money in that case to two Yosef ben Shimons because there you know which one is which, or as we called it, number one and number two. Says, okay, well, if that's the case, then the fact that you have a receipt that says Yosef ben Shimon paid you back, why don't you look at the receipt and see which one? V'nichsi tavra, right? Look at the receipt, look at this document, bishma deman k'dichtiv, which Yosef ben Shimon paid you back. And says Rav Hoshaya, obviously the very fun case of our Mishnah is the Mishulashim b'shtar, ve'in Mishulashim b'shofar. It's exactly the problem. You wrote a shtar to Yosef ben Shimon ben Ruvain that he owes you $1,000, right? You have a shtar that says Yosef ben Shimon ben Yaakov owes you $1,000, and you have a receipt that says Yosef ben Shimon pay me back the loan, but you didn't write which Yosef ben Shimon, and therefore because you don't know which one, it could be either one. You can't go and claim from either of them because you've proven that one paid you back, and so that's the Mishnah's chiddush, is that. Not a chiddush, it's a statement that in fact you have to assume that it could be either one and you cannot collect from them. So that is Rav Hamnuna's explanation, and Rav Hoshaya's explanation. Abaya says, well, no, we have a whole different explanation. You turn it around. Hachikama, this is what the Mishnah is referring to. It's talking about not where the malveh, the lender, found this document. It's where nimsa liloveh bein shtarotav. It's where the Lova found among his documents, one of the Yosef, the Lova, found among his documents, shtarosha Yosef ben Shimon alai parua, that the loan that Yosef ben Shimon gave to me is collected, then shtarot shnehem pruin, then they're both collected, and that means the case, remember the Mishnah, our Mishnah held that Yosef ben Shimon can lend money. So each Yosef ben Shimon lent $1,000 to Ruvain. Ruvain's the Lova, and each one has a document. Yosef ben Shimon A has a document that says Ruvain owes him $1,000, and Yosef ben Shimon B has a document that says Ruvain owes him $1,000. But the Ruvain has a document that says I paid back $1,000 to Yosef ben Shimon, and so since he has that, and it might be either Yosef ben Shimon, so therefore shtarot shnehem pruim, then they both would be considered collected, meaning not really considered collected, but as we always say, they would have to prove that it wasn't their shtar that was paid back. And since they can't, because they have the same name, they would not be able to collect from Ruvain in this case. So you got to be very careful when you're lending money if someone else has the same name. Said the Mishnah last line before our new Mishnah, Ketziv Yasu Yishalishu. What do you
Then they
do?
can look at the handwriting.
I guess. I mean, well, that's part of what we're saying here, but I don't know. They often hired a sofer, right? It doesn't seem an argument that most people wrote things on their own. So presumably, if you went to the same company, it would all look the same. But yeah,
But someone signs it, right?
I mean,
So someone says handwriting of the signature.
the witnesses sign it. I mean,
Whatever. I mean, okay, but the person doesn't he himself sign it? No.
I don't think so. I'm not sure why he would. I don't think so. No. Um, says the Gemara now.
No, I don't know. People could, and they witness the signature. People not signing a document one to the other. He signs it, and the witnesses verify
Right.
that's the signature. It could happen.
It could happen. And it could also happen that they look different as the Mishnah's continued, and that they say one is tall, one is short. So Ketziv Yasu, what do? Yishalesha, you should provide a third generation. Tana Emhayu Shneim Kohanim. Remember, our Mishnah said, what if they're both of the same grandfather's name? Then you describe the characteristics of them. One is tall, one is short. What if they are the same? Then you describe one as a Kohen. What if they're both Kohanim? So the Gemara says, obviously, you can keep writing Yichtavu Dorot. You go back and you write generations. So, eventually everybody has unique parents or unique great grandparents, unless they're the same person. And so if the grandfather's the same name, you write the great grandfather. If they have the same name, you keep going back until you hit a difference in the generations to distinguish these two Yosef ben Shimons who live in the same city. So that is what you would do. There's a whole discussion nowadays. Obviously, people use family names. Like can that replace it? People change their family names. All kinds of interesting questions about what we should actually write in a shtar. Now, continues the Mishnah. We're about to have a new Mishnah, but says the Mishnah towards the end of Nefai and Gimel and Aleph, we're going to get you to Shul on time. Okay, Ken, I know you got to get there, so don't worry. Haomer Libno, person says to his son, person's on his deathbed, and he says to his son, I have all these documents. You're going to find all these notes that say, people owe me money after I die. I just want you to know that one of them was paid back. Shtar bein shtarotai parua. One of the shtarot that I have, someone paid me back, and I never gave him back the loan, so it was a mistake. But I don't know which one it was, and then he dies, right? So basically, he says, I know that one person paid me back. There's 10 shtarot there. It says the Mishnah shtarot kulam pruim. You have to assume that everyone is paid, meaning not every single one, but you can't prove that it's not, and therefore you can't collect any of them. Now, if you happen to have two debts to one person, right? So this guy who died, Ruvain, has lent $1,000 to Shimon and $5,000 to Shimon. Then obviously he didn't pay back both. He just said one of them was paid back. So you know for sure that one of them is not paid back, and you can collect the smaller one. Hagadol parua, vakaton eina parua. You can collect the bigger one, but you obviously cannot collect the smaller one. Sorry, you cannot collect the bigger one. You have to assume the bigger one was paid back, and you can collect the smaller one. Amar Rava. Now it says Rava, just to add a little detail to this. It depends on how you say it. If you say shtar lecha biyadi parua, that one of the documents that I have in my hand has been paid back, then you have to assume, again, if you have two, that the gadol is parua, that the larger debt is paid back, and the katan is ena parua, and the smaller one is not, and so the estate can go and collect the smaller amount from Shimon. But if the language you used was chov lecha biyadi parua, that a debt in my hand has been paid back, then you don't know if it means one debt or the collective debts, right? Maybe it means all of the debt owed to me by somebody was paid back. So even though I lent 5 times to Shimon, it might be that chov means all of those, and therefore shtarot kulan pruim, you have to assume that all of them are paid back, and so you can't collect anything. Now, Amalei Ravina Rava, instead of Ravina to Rava, I just want to analyze your language. Let's say a person uses a similar language when they talk about a field, let's say. Let's say a person says, Sadi mechuralach, right? My field is sold to you, right? And now the person doesn't say which field. So a guy, Ruvain, takes $1,000 from Shimon and writes in the document, or says at least, I sold you my field, right? So it says the Gemara, Sada gedolah mechuralach. You have to assume that it's the largest field. We'll ask about this in a question, right? And Sadeh Sheyeshli Mechuralach, if he says the field that I have, and the Rashbam explains, we don't mean an individual field, he means the property. Sadeh here means the land ownings that I have are sold to you. Then what he means is all of my land. Kol Sidotav Mechurim Lo. He gets everything, right? So here you sort of see the opposite, which is that basically when I say I'm giving you a field, it means I have to give you the biggest field. And why in the debts did we say you assume it's only the smallest debt? Says the Gemara, well, because the obvious difference is who's the lender, right? Hatam, in the case that Rava was referring to, which was the case of our Mishnah, Yad Bal Hashtar al Tachtona. The person who has the shtar, who says someone else borrowed money from them, is at disadvantage because they are going out to collect money from somebody else. So when you go out to collect some money from somebody else, you have to assume that it's the smallest amount that you can prove is given to you. Continues the Mishnah, the last Mishnah of today, which is a very interesting Mishnah that I just want to clarify. We're going to discuss in great detail going forward, probably till the end, close to the end of the Masechta. Hamalvet chavero ayidei arev. They finally get to an issue that we have raised before, and it's very relevant, which are guarantors, right? So let's say you lend money to somebody, but you have a guarantor in the loan. Now, I'm going to give a tiny introduction, that there's different categories of guarantors, right? An arev is a term we're familiar with. It means a guarantor. There's something that we've talked about before called a kablan. And a kablan, not as a contractor, but a kablan is someone who accepts responsibility for the debt, which is a higher level of acceptance than an arev. He doesn't just guarantee it. He says, I actually will pay it back primarily. And we will discuss in our Gemara which ones our Mishnah is referring to and what the difference is between those two and how you make the difference. But it says the Mishnah, let's read the words. If you lend someone money through a guarantor, lo yipara mina arev. You're not allowed to collect from the guarantor, which seems to make no sense because what's the point of them being a guarantor if you can't collect? Turns the Gemara to Kuf Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. Lim amarlo. Now, if you write in the loan, or you say, Al minat she'apra mimisha artzeh, I'm lending you $1,000 with the guarantor of Levi on condition that I can collect from whoever I want. Then you are allowed to collect from the guarantor. And again, we'll discuss in the Gemara what this means. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, I disagree. Im yesh nechasim leloveh. If the borrower has money, even if you write, this is what we think it means, we're going to change this. Even if you write, that I want to collect from wherever I get to collect from wherever I want, still you have to go to the loveh first. Benkach or benkach, whether you write this or you don't write it, lo yipara min ha'arev, you're not allowed to collect from the guarantor. And furthermore, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel similarly said, we are in the end of the Mishnah, ha'arev li'isha b'ktubata. Right? Let's say a man marries a woman and he guarantees her 200 mana as a ketubah, and he doesn't have it, right? And the woman says, I'm not marrying you because you're never going to pay me. So he says, well, I have a guarantor, right? My friend Shimon will be the guarantor for the ketubah. The problem we worry about now is, let's say Reuven divorces her and he doesn't have any money to pay her, so she goes to Shimon to pay. The worry is that she'll go to Shimon to pay and then go back and remarry Reuven, right? Because it's just a ruse to get money out of Shimon. So we worry that that's going to happen. So says Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, "Harev leisha b'ktubata." Let's say a person guarantees a woman's ketubah, v'haya ba'ala migarsha, and the husband now is coming to divorce her, and they're going to collect from the arev yidireno hana'a. The husband has to make a neder that he'll never be back with her again, that he'll never remarry her, that he'll never get benefit from her, because we're worried that if he doesn't, shema yasu kinunya on the chasim shel zeh v'yachzir et ishto. Maybe he's making a kinunya, I don't know how we translate kinunya in English, but like a trickery with the possessions of the arev, and then he's going to remarry her. He's divorcing her for fake, basically, to get the money from the ketubah, and then he'll remarry her. So therefore, he's got to make a neder that he's never going to get hana from her, which means he can't ever remarry her. Now, back to the first part of our Mishnah. When we say you lend someone with an arev, you're not allowed to collect from the arev. My time says Gemara, why not? That's what the purpose of an arev is to collect. Says Rabba Rav Yosef Amri Tervayo, look, all the arev guaranteed, this is what we understand now, is not that I'm going to pay you back, but Gavra Ashlimtali. I'm a man, I'm a person who will take responsibility if that person is not there. Gavra Ashlimalach, but that person is here. Meaning, even if Reuven lends money to Shimon, and Reuven says, I want a guarantor of Levi, Levi's responsibility, according to Rabbi Rav Yosef right now, is not to pay back the loan. It's to make sure that Shimon is there and Shimon pays it back. Shimon will be present. Not Shimon pays it back. Shimon will be present. If Shimon dies or Shimon runs away, Levi, will take his place. But if Shimon is still there, even if Shimon is broke, you can't come and collect from me. All I said is that I'm going to replace the person. The person is there. So that's what Rabbi Rav Yosef said. Matim for Rav Nachman, who remember was the Dayan, said, that's ridiculous. Hi, Dina de Parsai. That sounds like you're doing it like Persian rules, right? The Parsa rules. Now, the Gemara thinks right now that this means that's not Jewish law, that's Persian law. And we ask, that's not true because it's not Persian law. I don't know Persian law, but the Gemara did. Adarabba, says the Gemara. In Persian law, Batra Arva Azli. In Persian law, they actually go to the Arev first. It's not that they never go to the Arev, which is what our Mishnah said. They never go to the guarantor. They go to the guarantor right away, even if the person's still there and has money. Ella, that's not what Rav Nachman meant. Rav Nachman said, you're doing Persian law was a derogatory comment, saying you're acting irrationally. So he was using them in a negative way. Beidina de Parsai, not that it's Persian law, it's acting like a Persian court where they are somewhat arbitrary. Lo yav taima lemiltayo. They do things that make no sense, right? Meaning they are arbitrary in their judgments, and you're saying something which really makes no sense. You've decided that when someone says I'm a guarantor for a loan, they don't really mean I'm guaranteeing the loan. They mean I'm guaranteeing the person. Where in the world do you get that sense from? Elam Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman, that's not what our Mishnah means at all. When our Mishnah says you cannot, my lo yipara min ha'arev, you can't collect from the guarantor, it means you can't collect from them initially. Lo yitzba arev tchila. You can't say, look, why should I go back? I lent money to Ruvain, right? Shimon lent money to Ruvain, and Levi was the guarantor. I don't even want to deal with Ruvain. He's always, gives you the runaround. He doesn't have a lot of money, whatever. He's a hard guy. Levi's a rich guy. I'll just go to Levi and get it. That's not what an arev means. An arev is not a replacement. An arev is if the person doesn't have the money, the arev does it. But you can't go to the arev first. And Taina Mihachi, in fact, the Breita elaborates on our Mishnah and makes this very clear. Trying to think where I am. Taina Mihachi, it's like 12, 15 lines from the top. Hamalvet chaver al yidei arev. Person who lends money with a guarantor, lo yitzba arev tchila. You cannot go to the arev first. You can go eventually. So when our Mishnah said don't go, it means don't go first. V'im amar, and this is now a quote from our Mishnah, or a paraphrase of our Mishnah. If you said in the loan, I'm going to collect from whoever I want, then, and the Arev signs that, Yitba Arev Tchila, then you can go to the Arev first if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. Now, it says Rav Huna, the first word on a line, though other than that, it's like 15 lines from the top. Amar Rav Huna, Minayin la'arev de mishtabed. Where do we even have this idea that an Arev works? It's a weird question, right? Because, you can make anything up you want, but obviously we always love to find sources for things in the Torah, and the Rashbam's point here is that this is, generally an Arev does not make a kinyan. Right? Usually if you want to give something to someone, you have to make a kinyan. And Arev just says, I'm the guarantor. Maybe they sign it and they agree, but they didn't make a kinyan. How do you know that? By just saying that you're going to be the Arev, that you become responsible? Because we have a very famous story in next week's parsha, right? It's next week, I think, or 2 weeks soon, coming up, where Shimon was captured by Yosef and Mitzrayim, right? And Yaakov didn't want to send Binyamin. And we say, Anochi arvenu, I have the words, I will be the Arev, miyadi tivakshenu. You can get him from me. So you see that just saying that is enough to have a meaning. Matkif Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, but that's not Arevut. That's a deeper level of commitment. That's called kablanuti. That's called kablanut. Kablanut is where you basically take an active role in the loan. Kablanut is essentially where Ruvain, instead of borrowing money from Shimon, Shimon gives the money to Levi, who hands it over to Ruvain. And that means Levi, of course, is an integral part of the loan. Because in this case, Yehuda said, Tana ota al yadi vani ashivenu. Right? Yehuda said to Yaakov, give him to me and I'll bring him back. So I'm not just a guarantor, I'm the higher level of kablanut. El Amr of Yitzchak Mihacha. Instead of Yitzchak, it's from other psukim in Mishlei. Right? We have several psukim in Mishlei that talk about in Arev. And this pasuk is, I'll read it inside. This pasuk is, we're halfway down. It says, Lakach bigdo, take someone's clothes, ki arev zar, because you were an arev for a stranger, uv'ad nachriya chavleu, and for a stranger, for a nachriya, a woman who's not a nachri, you became agreed to give a chavala, which is a guarantee. V'omer, and further it says in Mishlei, Bini, my son, imarafta re'acha, if you become an arev for your friend, to kata lazar kapecha. You basically have shaken hands with a foreigner, meaning you're giving your rights up to a stranger. No kashta beimrei picha, you are trapped by, or you've become ensnared by the words of your mouth. No kadata beimrei picha, it's another language for being trapped, and no kad. Asay zot efo b'ni, this is what you should do, my son. V'inatzel, and you'll be saved from the situation. Ki bata b'kafreyacha, you basically put yourself in the control of another person. Leich hitrapes rahavreyacha. You should go and hitrapes. You should be kind to them. You should be nice. You should ask for forgiveness, and you should make many friends. Rahav means you should have many friends around you. Meaning, in mamon yesh lo biyadcha, if the person has money, hiter lo pisat yad, you should give him the palm of your hand. Meaning, you got to just pay. There's no way out. Once you committed to give money to somebody, you're going to have to give it. Vimlav, if you don't have the money, right, or if it's just words, then harbe elav re'im, you should get many friends to go talk to him to ask for forgiveness, right? Anyway, so that is basically how we learn from a asmachta in a pasuk in Mishlei that just your words can be enough to require you to pay back. Now, Amar Amemar, said Amemar, we'll get to the two dots hopefully. Said Amemar, hopefully everyone has the place. It is, I don't even know how to say where we are, but around 20 lines from the bottom. Arev de mishtabe, whether an arev, a guarantor, is actually responsible to pay back, that in fact is a machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. That's a machloket that we had around a week ago of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Remember the case of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is where someone gave their document to a third party, right? And they said, look, if I don't come back and get it from you within a year, I want you to give it back. Right? I mean, I borrowed $1 million, I pay back 500,000. We hold on to the star. The star is now held by a third party, and you say to them, if I don't come back and repay you within a month, I want you just to give it away to the love, to the malva, sorry, and I'll pay the whole thing again, right? So we in a machloket about whether you really give it back, right? Because we said that's an asmachta. You said something that you really didn't think was going to come to. You only said that because you thought you were going to pay it back. You didn't really intend for yourself not to pay it back and to have to pay the loan again, right? So we had a machloket whether a smachta is kanya or not kanya. Says Gemara, an arev is the same thing. When you guarantee your friend's loan, you don't really think you're going to have to pay it back. You think he's going to pay it back, but you're trying to grease the wheels. So it says the Gemara, let's read it inside. That's a machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, the Amar Smachta Kanya. Rabbi Yossi says that when you say an asmachta, which is something that you think is not really going to come to pass, then arev mishtabed. Then a guarantor is the same thing, and you have to pay. Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Smachta lo Kanya. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who says an asmachta is not kona, then arev lo mishtabed. So therefore, the whole concept of arev depends on how you feel about the halacha of asmachta. Amar le Ravashi la Amemar, and Ravashi said Amemar, you're way off. It can't be true because hamaasim b'chol yom the asmachta lo kanya. Every day we paskin, this is the accepted halacha that asmachta is not kanya. That if you say something that we think is far fetched, you didn't really mean it, we say you're not responsible for what you said. But we always rely on guarantors. The arev mishtabed. It's common practice that asmachta is not kona, but an arev is responsible. So they can't be the same halacha, or they would have to be consistent. Ella Amar Ravashi, Amar Ravashi. The fact is that an arev is different than asmachta. And the reason arev is different than asmachta is because the guarantor gets something out of the deal. And what is that? It's bahahu hana dekama hemimle. Through the benefit of being known, this is usually the way we understand it, that you are an upright person who's being trusted by the courts, right, and by lenders to be the guarantor, you get benefit from that. It raises your stature. It gives you, greater credibility in the business world, which helps your business and helps your loans and helps everything. And therefore, you got something out of it. Because you got something out of it, Gomer Mishtab and Nafshe, you agree to really pay if you have to pay. So it's not that you're just saying, oh, they need to loan money to him. I know he's good for it. I'll put my name on it so that people will do it. You know that you get something out of being an RA. If people recognize you as being a businessman and a respected person, and therefore because you get something out of it, you're willing to give. And you legitimately are willing to commit to pay back the money if Ruvain doesn't pay back the money. And that's why Arevut is different than Asmachta. We are going to stop there at the two dots, 10 lines from the bottom, but we will continue tomorrow and throughout this week to discuss exactly what an Arev is, what kind of terminology, what a person accepts, and what we mean by this beautiful and complicated concept.
How are we defining asmachta here in this situation?
The smachta is incredibly difficult to define, so I can't give you a clear answer. The case before, of course, was where we said it was far-fetched. The person really seemed to assume that it wasn't going to come to pass. So they said, remember the case earlier was where you gave your document that you had partially paid to a third party, right, to watch for you. And you said to that third party, if I don't come back and pay it, and in 12 months, you can give it back to the lender. We assume in that case that the person had no intention of not paying it. They thought they were going to. So they did not expect this to come to pass. But your question is a very important and deep question about what if you thought there was a 10% chance or a 50% chance or 100%, I mean, what's the exact cutoff? And I think I don't have a definition. I don't think our Gemara really gives one very consistently, but it's an important point.
But we're saying that he didn't think someone was going to pay it back, and therefore
Correct.
return the document.
Correct. We don't know. Therefore, you don't return the document because you assume he didn't really want him to do it. That was the machloket before.
You don't return the document.
It was a machloket. It was machloket Tanaim in the Mishnah a week ago about whether you
Right.
return it or not.
And
If you
so
hold
that,
asmachta kanya, then you do return it. If you hold asmachta lo kanya, you don't return it.
and if you don't return it, the person is obligated to pay, right?
He is, well, the third party still has it, but he doesn't give it back to the lender. So you'd have to come to court, you have to bring it all together.
Well, is there still an obligation to pay then? He doesn't.
Yeah. There's an obligation to pay, whatever amount you didn't pay already.
And if he does return it, their obligation
Then
is
he has to
void
pay, and he doubles it, then he pays even more.
Well, if he returns the document to
He returns it to the lender, so the lender can recollect with the same document. The question, again, this was last week's stuff, not today's stuff, but the question was whether Ruvain lent $1,000 to Shimon. Shimon paid back some of it, but not all of it. So they don't know what to do with the document now, right? So one thing we said last week was you give it to a third party who you trust, and they hold on to it so that they basically won't allow Ruvain to collect $1,000, but they won't allow Shimon to get away with paying nothing, right? But he said to him, if I don't come back and pay and finish this loan within a month or a year, you can give the whole document back to Ruvain. He'll come and collect the whole $1,000 again. Okay, then that was last week's stuff.
Yeah, okay, all right.
So Shavua Tov, God willing, I will pick up and see you all again next Motzei Shabbat for Masechet Sanhedrin, but we're not quite there. I look forward to finishing together. Shavua Tov.